All right. Hello, everyone. I'm back here with Dr. Tripurdaman Singh, who is a historian. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University College London and the author of this wonderful book, 16 Stormy Days, which I highly recommend. Recently won the Ramnath Goenka Award, which is the most prestigious award in journalism. Dr. Singh got his PhD from the University of Cambridge. It's great to have you on.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you for inviting me.
So we'll talk about this book and the recent book, Nehru, the Debates that Saved India, both of which, Nehru plays an important role in both of the books. But I recently, as in just 10 minutes ago, I saw your recent article, which is India, the authoritarian roots of India's democracy. And well, I have thoughts on this. I haven't had the time to read the article because I saw it just 10 minutes ago. But I think that would be a good place to start. So if you could just give me an outline of the argument that you've made there.
I mean, the argument is quite simple. It's basically that India has authoritarianism by design. So the constitution facilitates concentrations of power which is basically what authoritarianism rests on. So unlike its American counterpart, it's not animated by an impulse of limiting or containing political power, but generally of facilitating executive power and channeling it for the purposes of social reform. Now, social reform can, of course, it's an open-ended category. I mean, what is social reform to me may not be social reform to someone else. And what is social reform to someone else may not be a social reform to a third person. So these are ultimately nebulous categories, which can be, are up for redefinition given whatever constellation of forces comes to power. And so ultimately, in my opinion, the idea that India is sliding towards authoritarianism or that there is any sort of backsliding is all a misnomer, because effectively, given the nature of India's constitutional structure, a particular kind of authoritarianism is already baked in, which is not only there, but it enjoys wide legitimacy and ultimately a kind of political consensus. Because nobody is challenging it. They might accuse each other of being authoritarian or dictatorial, but nobody is particularly interested in challenging those parts of our constitutional settlement or institutional structure that this type of authoritarianism rests on.
So when you say it's baked into the Constitution, are you talking about after the First Amendment? Are you also referring to when the Constitution was made before the introduction of the First Amendment?
No, before the First Amendment as well, right from the outset. I mean, the Constitution privileges the center vis-a-vis the states. It massively privileges the state vis-a-vis the individual, and it massively privileges the executive vis-a-vis the legislature. So it is, and it also retains the kind of low-grade bureaucratic authoritarianism of the colonial state. So it didn't, and some might argue to a large extent, it still doesn't, particularly like lower levels of government. But the politicians prefer to rule through the bureaucrats, who in turn, of course, prefer to not have much legislative, check on their power. And that is by design. That's because India was formed as a social revolutionary state, and for its founders to achieve what they thought of as their social revolution, they needed the state to have powers to intervene quite vigorously in the domain of the social. And so the state can't really settle social questions unless it has the powers to intervene quite heavily in them. And those powers can only come at the cost of containing civic freedom.
Now, I think that our early founding fathers had a kind of fascination with the state, which has been pointed out. You briefly cited Madhav Khosla in an article. It's also been pointed out by Pratap Mehta, which is that they saw the state as, you talked about the state as a sort of emancipatory agent. They looked up to the state as an emancipatory agent, as an agent of social revolution. And your argument seems to be that that is creating the broad outlines for authoritarianism. So, are you referring to the socialist aspects of the constitution here? And why do you
To
think the fascination with the state, where does the fascination of the state arise in our founding fathers, with figures like Nehru, or even like people like Bose? And so where does this fascination arise from?
Partly the fascination arises from the fact that they see around them, in a sense, social problems, right? For Ambedkar, the question is caste. For Bose and Nehru, the question is of material destitution and poverty. And for others, it is generally some mixture of the two, that India is backward, that India is poor, and so on and so forth. And they see, partly, of course, and this is a rather lazy reasoning to which, not even necessarily lazy, but it's a very easy reasoning to which they subscribe, which is that this is caused either by colonialism or by capitalism. In many cases, they see the two forces as overlapping and heavily interlinked, which admittedly in part they were. And so the idea is that the nation's founding is at one level about political freedom, but at another level, it's also meant to be some sort of solution to these lingering questions. And this attempt to solve social questions by political means is what really animates them. And they're not alone in this. Of course, socialism was the vogue in large parts of the world at that point in time. For people like Ambedkar, of course, given what they had gone through, it's unsurprising that they didn't believe that society had the capacity for reform in and of itself. And equally interestingly, those were global forces. They were not immune to global intellectual currents, especially people like Nehru, and many others believed that the emancipatory force of state power could be utilized to solve these questions. Now there is an argument to be made that they were not entirely wrong. Even I would agree that they were not entirely wrong, but doing so has consequences, and I don't think they were very aware of those consequences. And I also don't think that they were particularly considerate about those consequences. It's important to remember that when the Constitution was being made, the very people who were making the Constitution were also ruling the country. There was no, Rawlsian veil of ignorance to kind of shield one process from the other. The Constituent Assembly itself was functioning as the provisional parliament. It would sit in the morning in a constituent capacity, and in the afternoon as in its legislative capacity. And so concurrently, the experience of running the government, of like the nuts and bolts of legislation and keeping government going in the aftermath of partition and the aftermath of independence, the aftermath of war in Kashmir, police action in Hyderabad, violence in the Middle East, communist rebellion in parts of South India, those factors weighed very heavily on them. So at one level, it's unsurprising that they would, in a sense, think the way they did. What is surprising is that they seem not to be able to reason out what the long-term consequences of would be of what they were doing.
But it seems to me like this was consistent with the thinkings that were going on in the third world at that time. Uh,
Mhm.
because recently, after the entire gambit of imperialism studies developed with Franz Fanon's book, and the argument there was essentially the same, which is the attachment of colonialism with capitalism that later developed into the development stage theory,
Mhm.
elaborated by Sentosa. So so do you think that this was perhaps there were men of their time, and because you seem to be arguing that they could not look uh, they were not visionaries in the sense that they could not foresee the consequences, but at the same time it, it was the thought that was going on around at that time, and they had very good reasons to believe that there was a strong connection between capitalism and imperialism.
No, I'm not denying that there is force to their arguments, and I'm not making the claim that they're not visionary either. I guess, to a certain extent, everyone, including historians like me, are creatures of their times. I mean, even the questions we ask for historical inquiry are somewhere informed by the world we live in and the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So, in that, I wouldn't critique them for that. Uh, a constitution making exercise is by very nature meant to be something that, if not permanent, is at least meant to last quite a long time. It's not meant to be a transient sort of question, and therefore, whatever constitutional settlement is arrived at is has to satisfy more than just the immediate need that the rulers feel. And in India's case, that was doubly true because there wasn't a sharp rupture between the colonial state and the modern state. So the independent state of India, in a sense, took on not just the legal personality of the British Raj that preceded it, it also took on its administrative frameworks, its laws, its bureaucratic structures, its institutions, and so on and so forth. And so, because there was no rupture, of course, there was the violence of partition and all of these questions, but everyone who was there in the assembly understood and admitted that what they were doing was an experiment that they hoped would stand the test of time. Now, if at that level, to me, it would sound it is slightly inexplicable that that you wouldn't consider the longer term consequences of the steps that are being taken. And it's not as if people are not warning you about what might or might not happen. Granville Austin referred to the Constituent Assembly as essentially being an oligarchy dominated by about half a dozen people. And so it's not as if there is no one to warn against what could become abuse of power. It's like a very obvious dictum that if you create structures which are open to abuse, they will sooner or later be abused, right? So a constitutional structure cannot simply rest on entirely on a belief in the goodness of leaders or the goodness of the men who are going to staff it. And I think that is the point at which I disagree or I find inexplicable.
The one thing that I find peculiar perhaps is that the fact that our spiritual philosophical guides that we had, some people like Gandhi and Tagore, and even Iqbal for Pakistan, they had a certain skepticism of the state. That is, they understood the violence that comes with the establishment of the state. They consistently warned about it. Gandhi consistently advocated for lessening the power of the state, and Tagore was critical of modernity in the sense of the democratic state, as it were, which is that the authoritarian uh, elements that come with the establishment of a semi-social democratic state was already being talked about long before the Constituent Assembly. Why do you think that these ideas, the ideas of Gandhi's and Tagore and Iqbal, did not come into play at all in the Constituent Assembly debates?
Because largely they would not have conserved power for the leaders who were making the constitution. So I don't think we should discount instrumental reasons for the decisions that were made. As I said, there was no Rawlsian veil of ignorance. These people were making a constitution while they were also governing and ruling the country. And it's unsurprising that they would make, given that they had a program for social transformation, that they would make a constitution that would give them the power to bring that transformation to fruition. So for me, it's a very obvious answer. It's a very, they were very instrumental considerations. These people wanted power. Ultimately, we cannot forget that these are politicians. They're not philosophers there to score academic debating points. They're there to wield power, to acquire political power, and then to wield it for purposes that they see fit.
There is an inherent authoritarianism in that, where you conserve power for yourself, and that comes into play, I think, with the establishment of the Nehruvian state, which comes much later on. But it furthers, it strengthens and it legitimizes the mildly authoritarian parts of the Constitution. So I want to talk about the events leading up to that, because it was introduced in 1951, I think, June
The
1951.
Constitution isn't just mildly authoritarian. It, in a sense, uh, think of something, and I, point this out both in my article and in other, things that I've written. Think of something like the power of the ordinance, which effectively grants the executive the power to legislate in place of the legislature during peacetime, without the declaration of an emergency or anything of that sort. And it's a power that has been used from scratch. So the Constitution is inaugurated in January 1950. By September, 6-7 months later, you already have the Speaker, G.V. Mavlankar, writing to Nehru, complaining about how much the government is relying on ordinances. And Nehru's reply is very categorical. He said, we have to do a lot of things, and all of this debate and etc. just takes up a lot of time. And to me, this is, of course, a very obvious and egregious example of the kind of concentrations of power that the Constitution sanctions. It is the ability of the executive to legislate in peacetime in place of the legislature is unheard of in any other democratic dispensation. And so this is just quite an egregious example of the fact that our Constitution isn't just mildly authoritarian. It's a Constitution dedicated to facilitating the utilization of executive power.
It was also furthered by the dictatorial tendencies of Nehru, which you point out in your book, because the First Amendment is introduced when there is, basically speaking, no opposition to Nehru. Patel is too ill or dead, and the Nehru has given up on the party. He refuses to take part in the Congress Working Committee after the election of a candidate that he does not approve of. So he seems to personally want to wield power, and the introduction of the First Amendment was at least in part personally motivated. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was because I mean, you can conduct a thought experiment and say, would someone like Nehru have supported a an amendment like this if someone else was prime minister, uh, or an opposite ideological dispensation had taken power and was trying to create an amendment like this to give vent to its own version of social transformation, and probably not. And so there is a large personal element to it, because ultimately that power is going to be wielded by him. He is the head of the executive. And in Westminster systems, the prime minister has quite an inordinate amount of power. He is the head of the government. He's not an easy figure to challenge or to remove. And so Nehru was well aware that he was in that sort of commanding position. He was also well aware that there was quite a lot of tendency within the party and the cabinet to try and please him. For people interested in, in sinecures, in government positions, in ministerial office, and for many others interested in the forthcoming election. After all, they knew that Nehru would have a significant role in determining who would or would not get a nomination to run for the next election from the Congress party. So all of these factors play into his decision.
And this was pointed out by, you cite a letter by Rajendra Sachar, who later on headed the Sachar committee. And at this point, he is, I think, just starting out. And in the letter, he mentions that Nehru is Sekhi, that he wants to suppress all criticism of the government. Why is he so Sekhi that he wants to suppress all criticisms of the government? Uh, Nehru's argument here, when introducing the First Amendment, seems to be that it's not to suppress criticism as much as it is to make administration easier, that he will not abuse the power that the First Amendment grants. How justified do you think that argument is?
I mean, obviously, he's never going to say, no one is going to say that they're going to abuse the power that they're taking. So it's always going to be couched in high-minded language. And part and parcel of a job of a historian or any sort of critical scholar is to look past this high-minded language to excavate why something is happening. And of course, it is fair to say that Nehru didn't abuse it, say, to the extent that Indira did. But it's not fair to say that he wasn't aware of what the consequences would be at all. His argument is that people should trust Parliament. Now, that's a very rather strange argument, because part and parcel of a robust liberal democracy is a healthy sort of skepticism of state power. And the fact that no one in the Indian political scene of that time, barring a handful of liberal figures, are able to articulate that voice or see anything wrong with the idea that the state should have these inordinate powers is quite a telling, it's quite a telling thing, in my opinion.
Now, the First Amendment, before it's introduced, it's opposed by the President Rajendra Prasad himself, who essentially argues that because Now, before we come to that question, can you please elaborate on the court cases leading up to that in development, which is the Ramesh Thapar and the organizer case, and then we can talk about Rajendra Prasad's.
So those, of course, concern freedom of speech. In the Ramesh Thapar case, it comes from the left. Thapar was very closely affiliated to the communists, and he had been heavily criticizing Nehru for the rather heavy-handed suppression of communist political activity that had been going on, including, and the trigger at that point had, of course, been the shooting of communist detainees in Salem jail. And I think they'd been shot by the police in jail, and some 20 or 25 of them had died. I forget the exact number. And that had really riled up the Congress government, and it was banned in then Madras province. And Thapar, of course, took the government to court because it was banned under a law called the Madras Maintenance of Public Order Act or something like that. All of the provinces had these public safety acts, which they drew on to ban the circulation of material they didn't like, or subject outlets to forms of censorship, and so on and so forth. And from the right, of course, he'd been criticized for his policy towards Pakistan and the refugee influx in Bengal. The organizer was the news magazine of the RSS, heavily criticizing him for, and it must be admitted, also quite provocatively criticizing him for his inaction in the face of what was happening to Hindus in East Pakistan, who were being in a state-sponsored, state-backed pogrom, effectively being driven into India in their thousands. And of course, that was adding a kind of heavy communal tinge to politics in West Bengal, including rioting. The police was frequently called out to control mobs. And many of this criticism, while of course the RSS and I guess in a sense, Hindu nationalist organizations were very vocal in their criticism, these feelings were shared across the board, including by sections of the Congress party and by large sections of the Bengali media. And there's even a letter where Nehru writes to the Pakistani Foreign Minister Zafrullah Khan, saying that he doesn't agree with the tone of the Calcutta press, and something will have to be done about it. And he sees this as an attempt to bully him or rile public opinion to force him to take a kind of more tougher stand against Pakistan than he wants to, because he, of course, at that point is trying to convince Liaquat Ali Khan for talks and to establish minority commissions, and eventually what becomes the Nehru-Liaquat Pact. Now, again, here, the interesting thing is that this is quite a legitimate political form, right? If you're unable to canvass public opinion or rile public opinion against a political opponent, then the avenue of how you're to express your political position is cut to you. How else do you do it? So, of course, there's also an intemperate exchange of letters between Nehru and Patel, where Nehru, tells Patel he isn't doing enough to rein in these organizations. At what point he also considers and is dissuaded by Patel against charging Shah Prasad Mukherjee with sedition, and ultimately they subject the organizer to a pre-censorship order, saying that they cannot publish any news or opinions connected to Pakistan without submitting them first for approval to the Chief Commissioner's office in Delhi. And that leads to the other quite famous court case, which is Brij Bhushan versus the state of and of course, in both these cases, the Supreme Court comes down quite heavily on the government, declares the relevant sections of the Public Safety Acts to be ultra-virus, and reiterates that now that India has freedom of speech, that freedom of speech is quite expansive, and it's the public order is not a ground on which it can be abrogated or proscribed.
Now, when he introduces the First Amendment, one of the cases that he references is, I think it was a judge that said, even if you incite murder for your wife, you should be allowed to do so. And that is quoted repeatedly in defense of the First Amendment. Which case
Yes.
was that?
This was a case in Bihar where someone, a press was, publishing material inciting inciting what they thought of as revolution, but of course couched in quite strong and violent language. One of the judges, Justice Sarju Prasad, muses at that point. It's Upaita Dicta. It's not a judgment. He muses that because there is no specific ground on which speech encouraging people to murder can be prescribed. People, if this position is not rectified by the Supreme Court, anyone will be free to, preach murder. And he was musing on the possibility, right? Because obviously it's that is quite a small legal
It's an
problem.
observation.
Yeah, it's an observation first for starters. But even more than that, it's quite a small legal problem, which can be, should the matter reach the Supreme Court. And eventually it did. I don't write about it in the book, but the court does have something to say about it. And of course, that particular legal problem can, of course, be quite easily solved without the quite wide amendment of the Constitution, the wide amendment that ends up happening. But it's one of these things.
Exact point that Rajendra Prasad makes.
Yeah, but it's one of these things that sticks. It's a very easy ploy to then use that to say, well, we have to do it because otherwise everyone will go around preaching murder, and we have no law to stop them. And ditto with what happens with zamindari abolition, because even though the Bihar Zamindari Abolition Act is struck down by the High Court, it is not struck down on the grounds of it's not struck down because on the grounds of right to property. It's struck down on the grounds that it violates the right to equality because it gives people differential rates of compensation. Someone is getting 5 times the rental value of their land. Someone is getting 20 times the rental value of their land. And there doesn't seem to be any particular logic on the basis of which this decision has been made. It's just it's an arbitrary classification that the government has engaged in. And so it's struck down because of that. It's a very narrow, very technical position, which again can be solved without taking recourse to the wide language that the amendment introduces. And that is also a point that Rajendra Prasad makes. But of course, Prasad finds himself completely ignored.
How does Nehru respond to Prasad's criticism?
Nehru's quite snappy with him, and I quote the letter. I quote the letter in the book. He gives him quite a curt reply, saying that they've decided this in the cabinet. They've consulted eminent lawyers, and effectively reads Prasad kind of the Riot Act and says that any other course apart from him, essentially following the advice of the Council of Ministers, would make the business of government difficult. And this is again a ploy that Nehru uses quite often to disarm his opponents, which is to threaten to resign. And he does that with Prasad as well.
That is fascinating because it doesn't just come out in your book; it also comes out in a lot of biographies of Nehru and Patel. Rajmohan Gandhi has written about those letters where he consistently threatens to resign if anything does not go his way. It tells Patel that, it's either you or me, basically an ultimatum. And those, like, if that threat is made once, then you can consider it sincere. But given that it's made so many times, then we have to ask, how sincere was he actually in his claim of resigning? Wasn't it just a ploy to ensure that people just shut up and stand with it?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, again, I at the risk of repeating myself, uh, these instrumental considerations are very, very important when looking at these questions. So you're absolutely right. I mean, Patel also threatens to resign, and again, in reality, I'd suspect neither of the two men wanted to resign. They had worked very hard and spent a lot of time in British jails to come to the position that they had. And so, in effect, neither of them resign. Normally, Nehru gets his way, and that is, of course, for reasons that go beyond just just the instrumental. Of course, Nehru was also phenomenally popular. He was the one who was wielding executive authority. And no one really wanted to trigger a political and constitutional crisis at that point. So generally, people step back from the brink.
One thing that surprised me while reading your book was the lack of opposition or any critique from uh, people like Ambedkar or C. Rajgopalachari, who is supposed to be this libertarian Indian hero. Do they agree with it in principle, or do you think that it was simply because they were part of the government that they did not speak up?
In the case of Ambedkar, I think the first thing we have to remember is that Ambedkar, like Nehru, was a statist. Ambedkar and Nehru were quite of one mind on a lot of questions, and the fact that they needed a strong state, both to keep the country together, to guarantee its security, and more crucially, to intervene and generate reform in Indian society, was something that they more or less agreed on. Now, Ambedkar probably, if the amendment had come in bits and pieces, may have agreed with parts of it and disagreed with parts of it. But given that it did not come in bits and pieces, given that it came as part of one package, the impression that I get is Ambedkar thinks, on balance, what it tries to achieve in the arena of social reform and the securing of the constitutional securing of reservations and affirmative action is worth the consequent price in on the question of freedom of speech. And of course, on Zamindari abolition, well, there is a very wide consensus that Zamindari abolition has to happen. And even the Zamindars themselves, one of India's largest Zamindars, Kameshwar Singh, is a member of the Provisional Parliament. Even he agrees that Zamindari abolition has to happen. The only question is on how much compensation is to be given, how it's to be given it. Again, quite sort of nitty-gritties of, but there's no real political opposition to the principle of Zamindari abolition. So that is, in some sense, the easiest part of the amendment. It's the bit that comes in for the least amount of criticism, because no one really, again, thinks of of what might materialize, of course, if the right to property is, in a sense, smashed in the way that it is being smashed. but also because there is such a wide consensus in favor of Zamindari abolition that question is never really raised. So Ambedkar, I think, takes a position that is relatively balanced, given his own opinions. I think that's the impression that I get. For Rajgopalachari, I think it is even more surprising that he took the position that he did, because in a sense, it seems to represent the antithesis of the political beliefs that he came to espouse later on in life, towards the kind of twilight of his life, when he formed the Swatantra Party and, in a sense, led the opposition to Nehruvianism. And here again, my impression is that they just don't seem to be able to comprehend just how serious the consequences of what they're doing are or can be. I can't say with pinpoint accuracy whether it's incomprehension, whether they're instrumental reasons, which is that they want to stay in government and not. And it could well be a combination of both, but I find Rajgopalachari's position more surprising than Ambedkar.
Now, another thing that you bring out in the book is Syama Prasad Mukherjee's speech in both of the books, and the full speech in Nehru's Nehru, the Debates That Defined India. It is an excellent speech, very well argued, exhaustive defense of freedom of speech and liberal rights, which is in complete contradiction with what the party represented later on in life. It became entrenched with the Nehruvian state, with the Nehruvian ideas, and even magnified that the sort of national security architecture, those laws which restricted freedom of speech. So, do you think that Syama Prasad Mukherjee comes from a place of conviction? Because reading that speech, it pretty much seems like it does, that this is really what he ideologically believes and cares for. Or do you think this was simply political convenience?
I mean, the only way that one would be able to know would be to test it, should he have gotten executive authority. But of course, he never did. He died a few years later. So we can never quite know for sure. But if we reduce everything to political opportunism and simply, to simple instrumental rationality, I don't think that would be true as well. So probably there was some element of instrumental rationality in him taking the position that he did. But equally, before that, he had been chairman of the All India Civil Liberties Conference, and he had articulated his stand relatively consistently from there. And he even called upon political parties contesting the first election to dedicate themselves to make an open declaration that they would repeal the First Amendment and take the Constitution back to its original condition should they win. And I think if that should demonstrate that there was sincere commitment to the political position he was espousing, because there would be no other reason for him to do it. So, of course, instrumental rationality shouldn't be discounted. I'm sure it was there. And maybe if Mukherjee was prime minister, he would have, and wielding executive power, he may have taken a slightly different attitude to the question. But there is sincerity, and there is the force of ideological conviction as well, which you can see through his activities in the All India Civil Liberties Conference.
Now, do you think that was Syama Prasad Mukherjee a lone voice in standing up in the Hindu right space of that time, in the Hindu nationalist space? Do you think he represented a lone voice, or was there an element of liberalism in the Hindu nationalist space, which you reference in one of the sentences? Was there an element of liberalism present in the Hindu nationalist space as an ideology?
Sure. I mean, yes, of course, there were. Mukherjee is not the lone example of it. There are people like N.C. Chatterjee, M.R. Jayakar, all of whom are at some level affiliated or have been associated with Hindu nationalist bodies, particularly the Hindu Mahasabha. And Mukherjee crucially leaves the Hindu Mahasabha. He leaves the Mahasabha on the question that of the Mahasabha allowing non-Hindus to become members, because his argument is that now that India has become independent and is a secular state, there isn't a need for a purely Hindu body to represent purely Hindu interests anymore. So that logic, there were several people who in a sense coalesced around the position that that Mukherjee represented. And I use Chatterjee and Jayakar as examples because they feature in the book. But Mukherjee also had a not always completely easy relationship with the RSS either. He when building his party, of course, they also differ on many things. Mukherjee was, for example, a very lukewarm backer of the first of the signature campaigns against cow slaughter and things like that. He was not particularly invested in a lot of the very, in a sense, in the questions of religion and culture as much as he was in the questions of political representation.
Now, you talk about how the First Amendment was the first step towards the creation of the Nehruvian state. And I'll just read out this paragraph because there's no other way to express the sentiments expressed. You write that Nehru's amendment was the first step towards the creation of the Nehruvian state, with its odious state apparatus, its prescriptive dominance of a personality-driven social agenda, its overwhelming primacy of executive authority, and its grim, resolute suppression of alternative ideological position, all precariously balanced against a pedantic dedication to democratic procedure and collective policymaking.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty strong words. And these are the same words that I would think a liberal today use for Mr. Modi.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm wondering is, because the idea of the Nehruvian state, according to many, there's a recent book out by Manas Firaq Bhattacharjee called The Nehru and the Spirit of India, where he essentially looks back with nostalgia at the Nehruvian state, which he is quite effusive about. And so the idea of the Nehruvian state has always been that of a plural, democratic, that Nehru was supposed to respect, have some respect towards the opposition. There's a book on the history of parliament which says that Nehru enriched the first years of the parliament through his respect and participation with the opposition. So the argument that you make, that sentence about the Nehruvian state, is in direct contradiction to that image. So do you think that they're in contradiction, or do you think that both are somehow, there's a truth to both of them?
No, I don't think they're in contradiction, because one thing, and this is, of course, to a huge credit to Nehru, is that Nehru never makes the claim that sovereignty resides anywhere else but Parliament. And so he's quite scrupulous in adhering to parliamentary procedure. He speaks in Parliament. He devotes quite a lot of time to parliamentary activity. Things are done more or less according to the book. Committees meet, resolutions are passed, cabinet meets. So in that sense, he is, and I use the word pedantic because in some senses it can be considered pedantic. But he is very committed to procedure, and of course, and that is a huge credit to him. If you look at his contemporaries in the post-colonial world, you look at Sukarno, you look at Nasser, you look at Nkrumah, you look at what happened in Pakistan. None of them are like that, right? None of them show any commitment to democratic process and democratic procedure. But what happens, and Gopal writes about it in his biography of Nehru, and I think Gopal is, in a sense, quite a sympathetic biographer, is that what was missing was the animating spirit. So Gopal refers to the Nehruvian cabinet as a collection of moldering mediocrities. And I have no comment to make on whether they were or they weren't. But ultimately, one of the reasons that it is easy for Nehru to do all this is because he is more or less getting the results that he wants. And you see it in the First Amendment itself, where he doesn't, for example, allow Congress MPs to vote according to their conscience. The whips are pressed into action to make sure that everyone follows the government line. And people know that if they don't follow the government line, they either may have to face the consequences later, they may not get a party nomination. No one, even though Nehru at that point is not the all-powerful figure that he is shortly due to become, of course, he's still a figure of much consequence, and no one quite knows where the chips will fall. And so he is a very adept wielder of political power. He's not a kind of soft, naive man. So I don't think there's, in a sense, a contradiction. It's very easy. I mean, the Nehruvian state, look at what it does in the domain of culture, for example. It intervenes very heavily in the domain of culture to an extent where the cultural sensibilities of the time come to be defined by the government's priorities. Film, theater, everything is produced, in a sense, to push and glamorize and portray the Nehruvian agenda in very good light. And so it's if you were in agreement with that agenda, yes, it's very easy to wax nostalgic about that time and think times were great. But arguably they weren't. And it seeded tendencies, legal structures, political opinions, and even more so something that's quite important in the Westminster system, conventions, precedents. It shaped the expectations that people had from government office or government offices, whether it was the office of the Prime Minister, whether it was the office of the Speaker, whether it was a relationship between government and party, and so on and so forth, in ways that proved to be quite detrimental on the longer term.
Yeah, not to mention that the critics within the film industry who were critical of Nehru were actually jailed. Majroor Sultanpuri, one of the greatest Bollywood poet, was jailed for 2 years because he criticized Nehru. Mm-hmm. So it certainly was not the liberal utopia that we'd like it to be.
I mean, it was in effect quite the opposite. I mean, think of legal instruments like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And if you read my article, the one that just came out, it makes a similar sort of point. I mean, think of what happened in Hyderabad. It remains the single largest case of mass violence against Muslims in independent India in history. So imagine what something like that would have looked like in the age of social media, with 24/7 news channels, international information flows, the internet, camera phones. Our own perception of the Nehruvian period would have looked very different.
In recent years, there's been a lot of criticism of Nehru, which was not seen in earlier years. Vajpayee notably was uh, always in praise of Nehru, and Mr. Modi and the present BJP government uh, does not get tired of criticizing Nehru, whether it's because of his foreign policy decisions and China and Kashmir and which were arguably bad decisions. But that ceiling, the Nehruvian consensus, at least rhetorically, seems to have been broken. But how far has there been a systematic change do you think there has been a systematic break in that consensus? Or do you think that the state that we live in is still Nehruvian, even more so now?
I think there's a mix. There's no easy answer to that question, because there is, in some senses, a kind of distaste for Nehru present, and there is a lot of criticism of him, as you mentioned, but in other ways, there's also a kind of unacknowledged embrace of some of Nehru's ideas. There is, in large sections of the Indian right, a kind of quite reflexive anti-Americanism, very similar to Nehru. There is a kind of the attitude towards state power and towards statism is broadly similar. So there are overlaps as well, and I think systematic attempts at the undoing of Nehruvianism will always come up against these roadblocks, in that much of the Indian right, in a sense, doesn't detest Nehru for all of the right reasons. So it's not as if they would, for example, detest Nehru for clamping down on freedom of speech. I mean, it might be a rhetorical point now, but it wouldn't become a political point where someone would stand up and say, okay, we're going to roll back the Nehruvian influence on freedom of speech. So in that sense, there is both dislike and there is an unacknowledged embrace as well. And the consensus, as far as the Nehruvian consensus goes, well, I think it was about time it was broken. And a large part of why Nehru is being criticized, someone might say, too much now, is that for the longest time he couldn't be criticized in the kind of regular intellectual establishment, because that was seen as something generally beyond the course of what was considered polite intellectual activity. So the only people who criticized Nehru were the Marxists. So the intellectual criticism came generally from a Marxist position, whereas those who belong to a more conservative or more right-leaning frame of reference or frame of intellectual opinion generally found themselves sidelined from the intellectual mainstream. So it's not, I guess it's not surprising that a lot of this criticism is materializing now. But I mean, if something is, I guess, not, if for intellectual traditions to develop, they have to go through the regular, institutional setups, etc. And if that space was not available, then it's unsurprising that it's developed in the way that it has.
But that consensus is not very dissimilar to the consensus that is present in, say, the United States with regards to the founding fathers. even though they were very flawed characters, Thomas Jefferson,
Mhm.
both Democrats and Republicans pay lip service. And that consensus is still present. So why do you think that should differ in the case of Nehru?
I think partly it's to do with the kind of suppression of the conservative tradition in India. Because there was a robust conservative intellectual tradition. It unfortunately found no space in universities, and universities are the primary spaces where intellectual positions, develop and filter out and move out into the world. And because it didn't, uh, it's grown in a very lopsided manner. So even now, India actually has very few conservative intellectuals. There are you could count them on the in the hands of your fingers, which for a country of 1.4 billion people is not where actually right-wing thought and right-wing political opinions are quite rife, or a certain kind of conservative political opinion is quite rife, tells its own story. So I wondered, I don't really know what else to say to that.
On the legacy of Nehru, what do you think now? If you balance it out, what are the things that he got right and what are the things that he got wrong? What is the relevance of Nehru's today? What are the things that we can learn from him? And what are the things that we should do away with?
I think a lot of Nehru's influence has to do with the fact that he came first. He got as much of a well, he obviously didn't get a blank slate, but he got as much of a blank slate as it might have been possible for anyone to have. And so, because he was the first, he shaped both the powers, the prerequisites, the expectations of his office, of a leader, of what was the proper or the improper way of doing things, and really established the kind of template for what it meant to be prime minister. Nehru was also, unlike a lot of his colleagues, familiar with the Westminster system to a much greater degree, having lived in Britain, having had friendships with British politicians, and been a frequent visitor there, and so on and so forth. So it's unsurprising that he has left as deep an imprint, as he did. I think some of the things that he got right were democracy. I mean, for starters, Nehru, despite having the power and the capability, and some might say even the temperament, to do away with the paraphernalia of democracy and to rule as a dictator, he didn't do so. Now, of course, one might argue, I sometimes do, that there was never the need to, because democracy was giving him what he wanted anyway. But still, the formal structures of democracy are important, and that he bequeathed them at the end of his life as functioning entities. How well they were functioning, well, that's open to question, but they were functioning. And I think that's a huge sort of check mark to his credit. And of course, the other that he thing that I do think he got right was, in a sense, okay, maybe I should rephrase myself, because I don't think he got it entirely right, but I do think he had the question of secularism was, he was on the right side of the answer. He unfortunately the experience of partition and of watching the large-scale violence unfold really seems to have altered his position, and then he doesn't quite follow through on the opinions and the arguments that he makes through the 30s and 40s. But I do think going back to the Nehru of the 30s and 40s and the arguments that he presents in the 30s and 40s, he was on the right side of the question of secularism. And I think that's the Nehru that should be remembered and embraced quite strongly as well. And so those, to me, are like two very, very big answers. And of course, what he gets wrong, well, there's a huge litany. The economy, the constitutionalism, the relationship with China and the outlook towards the world, the creation of a kind of a personality cult, the inability to understand or, in a sense, take into account the fact that he was, apart from the decisions he was taking in the immediate term, each decision was also a lot of those decisions were, going to lay the precedent for the future to become conventions. I mean, these things are again very, and in a sense, an inability to have a robust national conversation on the question of partition and on the question of what the relationship between the two communities was in the aftermath of partition. The inability to solve what used to be called the Hindu-Muslim question or the communal question. These are huge, and quite obvious negatives of the Nehruvian era.
Partisan seems to have sort of changed him because that comes out in his conversation with Iqbal, where he's quite secular and he does not understand the value or the danger that religion poses to people, or the impact that it has on the lives of the impact that tradition generally has on the lives of both Hindus and Muslims. With Hindus, he's quite critical of the Somnath temple, and he sees the economic aspect as more important than the religious aspect, which partisan was the antithesis of that. So I would, the argument there would be that the secularism that we have, which is often criticized by the right, the lopsided, they call it the pseudo-secularism, is in part due to the immediate, it emerged as an immediate reaction to the horrors of the partition.
Yeah. No, it does, because you see it's actually at loggerheads with the position Nehru is fighting for in the 1930s when he's arguing with Iqbal. And you can sympathize with that position, right? Ultimately, it can't be easy to be prime minister at a point where the partition has happened, where there's been mass slaughter, where passions are high. But equally, it's at that point that a substantial national conversation is warranted. And that conversation never really happens. There's an excellent book on, and it's not to do, of course, with Nehru alone. It also has to do with the Muslim community, which stays back in India, and its leadership or the lack thereof, who also fail to have this conversation or press for, in a sense, for national dialogue to get to terms with what's happened. There's an excellent book by Pratanav Anil on this subject. It's published by it's published by Hearst Publishers. I don't know whether it has an Indian edition, but he makes the same point that actually the elite leadership that's left over makes a forced impact with the Congress, limits themselves to the domain of culture, plants its flag on quite obscure things like personal law and triple talaq and and minority institutions, doesn't engage in any question of substantive political representation, and leaves a festering wound. And what these people do is that they take positions of power in the Congress, whether it's Azad, whether it's people like Begum Ezaz Rasool, others like Khaliquzzzaman, etc. One day get up and say we're going to Pakistan. So like you can see that there is that you can understand why Nehru takes the stand that he does, but equally it's a very problematic stand to take when looked at in the kind of long term, because he as much as anyone else should have been taking into account the longer term as well.
I did set a bad precedent. I understand that we've reached the end of our conversation. I enjoyed it a lot. Did you enjoy the conversation?
Yes. No, it's very great to talk to to someone like you who's young, who's reading, who's but also invested in the intellectual conversation. And it's great to be able to discuss it with you and with everyone who's who's going to be listening to this conversation. And I do hope they like it as well.
Yep. So I highly recommend this book, 16 Stormy Days. Excellent, terrific book again on the First Amendment of India. Also, the Nehru, the debates that saved India, which is a very short and well-written book. Like, subscribe, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.